We're not going to consider the New Testament documents as inspired for the purpose of this lesson. We are going to treat them as just historical documents. The reason for that is because that's going to be a fairer approach for skeptics of this, is what is historically accurate, apart from saying, well, the Bible's inspired and it says it happened. Well, for someone who's a skeptic, that's not going to do, because they don't believe in the inspiration of the Bible. But the question is, can we prove? I think we can, because we can prove the inspiration of the Bible and the integrity of the New Testament documents, that what they say is true. But aside from that, what does just secular historical evidence, and if you consider these as historical documents and add them in the mix, what does it say is the best explanation for what happened after Jesus of Nazareth was crucified? So the question, Michael Licona, he's one of the big old experts in this area. He's got a humongous book, so 700-something pages, called The Historicity of the Resurrection. He's one of the biggest experts in this, as other guys like Gary Habermas. But so Michael Licona, approaching this, says you need 3 R's to be able to approach this well. The first one is relevant sources. And what he means by that is the sources don't need to be some strange thing that wasn't even written near the time of Jesus, that was written centuries later in a place that didn't even have any connections with what happened in Jerusalem. You need relevant sources. So the New Testament documents are relevant sources. Josephus, the Jewish historian, he's a relevant source. Tacitus, Gnostic Gospels. Sometimes the Gnostics, even though we wouldn't agree with their theology, they're still relevant sources in that they will talk about who Jesus of Nazareth was and what happened to him by the hands of the Romans. And then earlier church fathers, as they're called. So you need them to be close to the time and in a good location to be relevant. Another, though, is responsible method. How early are these documents? The earlier, the better. Were they written by eyewitnesses? Can you prove that? That's always better. Another part of responsible method is looking at what enemies of the Christian movement said. Sometimes they are actually helpful in proving things because of what they say. So in other words, and we'll talk about this later, an easy example would be early Jewish Christian arguments about Jesus of Nazareth's resurrection and the tomb didn't look like, well, the tomb was empty. No, it wasn't. That's not what it looked like. The early argument was the tomb was empty. Well, they stole his body. Or the tomb was empty. Well, they went to the wrong one. You don't see anti-Christian Jewish writings saying, nah, the tomb wasn't actually empty. No, the explanation is something else. The tomb being empty is supposed, even by the enemies. Okay, so when you're asking the question, was the tomb of Jesus actually empty? Even the enemies of the Christian movement help to prove that as true. Now, that doesn't prove why it was empty. You've got to go a step further. But when asking that question, they help to prove that, because they don't argue that it wasn't empty. They just give an alternative explanation for why it was empty. Okay, they stole the body, or they went to the wrong tomb and thought it was the right tomb. Okay, so whatever tomb they went to, it was empty. Okay, so even their arguments help with that. And then things that we talked about some in here, when the Gospels or other documents in favor of the Christian movement include embarrassing things about themselves and the Christian movement, if you're just making this up, things that likely you would not have just made up and included, they actually add authenticity to the story because you're just reporting the facts, even though you'd be embarrassed to report it that way. And then, are they corroborated by multiple sources? The more sources that corroborate something, the better, right? So we use a responsible method of asking what is true and what's not. And then the last is restrained results, which is not leaving out facts, not straining the facts further than we ought to take them. A lot of objections here and there for what actually happened, but I don't think any of them stand the test of minimal facts that are pretty provable: Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. All the objections may get past one of them or two of them, but they don't get past all of them. And what happens is, when those facts are in place and no other theory but the actual resurrection of Jesus accounts for all of them, you have established a pretty continuum of certainty. Walk through each of these. Jesus of Nazareth was killed by crucifixion at the hands of the Romans. Okay? That they believed that Jesus rose and appeared to them. The historical fact is that his followers at least believed that. okay? And then the empty tomb, the tomb was empty, and that the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, the enemy of the cross. Can any other theory but the actual resurrection of Jesus by the hand of God explain all five of those things? Okay? So here's the first step. Did Jesus actually die on the cross? Plenty of people have said no, and there have been plenty of reasons throughout history. Karl Barth, Carl Venturini, great name. They proposed the swoon theory, that Jesus just fainted on the cross. He didn't actually die. The Quran says something similar about Jesus, that he didn't actually die on the cross. Some people say maybe Jesus was given a drug to give the appearance of death, and they might base that on Mark 15 with the stuff that they offered him to drink, okay, that might give the appearance of death. This for creating a ruse to get him off of the cross and look dead, and then present him alive again, okay? 1929, if you walk through the years, D.H. Lawrence said Jesus fled to Egypt after his resuscitation. And then in 65, Hugh Schonfield in the Passover plot says only the unanticipated stabbing by the centurion foiled the plot. And that doesn't prove he didn't die on the cross. He did, but he says there was a plot. In 72, Donovan Joyce in the Jesus Scroll says the death of Jesus was orchestrated by his disciples. And maybe the most popular Holy Blood, Holy Grail by Michael Bagent, and it's kind of in league with some of like the Da Vinci Code in 82, that Pontius Pilate was even bribed to help with this plot. Okay? Look, even extreme liberal John Dominic Crossan says that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical could ever be. Skeptic James Tabor says, I think we need to have no doubt that Jesus' execution by Roman crucifixion, he was truly dead. Gerd Ludemann, who's an atheistic New Testament critic, Bart Ehrman, who's a very popular New Testament critic and agnostic now, call the crucifixion an indisputable fact of history. Okay, so you have skeptics saying you're crazy if you say that Jesus wasn't actually crucified at the hands of the Romans and that he died. They may have alternative explanation for other stuff, but they're saying you're moving away from historical fact if you say that's not true. Why? You also have non-Christian sources that confirm the resurrection, or excuse me, that confirm the crucifixion. That'd be great, right? What if we, that confirm the crucifixion. Historian Tacitus says Jesus, quote, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius. Josephus, the Jewish historian, says Pilate condemned him to be crucified. Lucian of Samosata, a Greek artist, mentions the crucifixion. Mara Berserapian, who's a pagan, confirms that Jesus was executed. So you have multiplicity of historical. The Greeks, the Romans, the Jews, they all say he died by crucifixion on the cross. Okay? That historical fact is corroborated. It's also corroborated by what happened in the crucifixion. When we talk about people who we thought were dead and buried them and they came back because they weren't actually dead and we didn't realize it because of medical advancement, we just didn't realize it yet because we couldn't check a pulse. No, I'm just kidding. Whatever it was, the reasons that they couldn't at different times, we say, well, Rome was even further back. Here's the deal, the difference between this. Those people weren't trying to make sure this person was dead. The Romans weren't just burying somebody they thought was dead. They were killing somebody. They may not have been experts in medical science, but they were experts in killing. All right? And a centurion, if he didn't make sure that person was dead or that person got off the cross, they suffered the same penalty, which was crucifixion. Okay? So the idea of bribing a centurion to help a Galilean fisherman, help a bunch of guys that don't have anything to give him worth his time, isn't tenable. Okay? The Roman flogging was 39 lashes. Right? Why 39? It was 40 minus 1. That was a Jewish procedure, and I think the Romans might have even adopted it. Oh, the Romans could have gone. They asked. I'm assuming they would have gone a lot of times with the flogging according to Jewish procedure as well, if they were allowing them to do it. But the 39 lashes minus 1 was so that if they went over, they would suffer the same punishment. Whip braided with leather thongs and metal balls and pieces of bone woven in. Even parts of the spine would sometimes be exposed. From the shoulder, down the back, the buttocks, the back of the legs, a lot of people died during the flogging. They didn't even make it to the cross. Okay? So you're bleeding profusely. You are completely exposed. When we talk about the old rugged cross, that's important. Because when Jesus had to push himself up to get a breath, which we'll talk about in a second, he was pushing up against a rough piece of wood with an exposed back. Okay. Roman crucifixion. They nailed you in an outstretched position on that horizontal beam. We know about the crossbar, the spikes 5 to 7 inches long and tapered to a sharp point. They're driven through the wrists. I know we talk about the hands and feet of Jesus. The hand and the wrist were considered a part of one another in antiquity. So it says hand, but likely through the wrist based on archaeological evidence. They went through and severed the median nerve, which would not have been a pleasant experience. Nails were driven through their feet to the vertical bar. When they hoisted up, their arms were stretched apart. Both their shoulders were dislocated. From there, the painful death was actually by asphyxiation. They can't breathe. To push yourself up to say something or take a breath, you had to do it with a nail through your feet. Pushing up with the tarsal bones to exhale. As breathing slows, respiratory acidosis sets in, which I may be mispronouncing. Carbon dioxide in the blood dissolved, and then acidity of the blood increases. That causes erratic heartbeats. With low oxygen and erratic heartbeats, cardiac arrest would take place. The blood and water that comes out when he's stabbed with the spear, most medical people looking at this are saying we're talking about a pericardial effusion, which is fluid buildup around the membrane around the heart, which also caused pleural effusion, fluid buildup around the lungs. So when the soldier's spear goes through the lung and the heart, it releases both that clear fluid as well as the blood. So a Harvard Theological Review had once published and said there's astonishing little evidence that the feet of a crucified person were ever pierced by nails. It was said that they were tied by ropes instead. But then in 1968, archaeologists discovered the heel bone of an individual who had been crucified that had a nail still in it. And so it kind of blew that out of the water, and that archaeological evidence confirmed the New Testament documents. 3 dozen Jews killed in the AD 70 destruction, one who had been crucified, 7-inch nail still driven into his feet, and it contained pieces of olive wood still attached to it. Could they have just been mistaken with limited medical knowledge that Jesus was dead? Again, primitive in medicine, experts in killing. Would the Romans have agreed to a plot of a man who claimed to be king? No. Their goal was to crush any possible uprising of any other ruler because they were spread too thin, and that was the only way to maintain control. Was anytime you heard anybody claim to be king, it was a bad deal. That's why the Jewish people go to the Roman authorities with that claim. This man claims to be king, and we have no other king but Caesar, they say, because they know that'll get him crucified, because their goal is to crush anybody who claims any kind of authority. So this man claiming to be king of the Jews, are they going to accept that and agree to some kind of plot to save this man and then allow him to go on and create a following? And then wouldn't the centurion make sure he was dead, knowing full well Jesus wasn't just crucified, he was flogged before that, and they thrust him through the side into the heart with a spear. How does he survive that? So if these pieces of evidence are true, how could you survive? Interestingly, the question is asked, did anybody ever survive crucifixion? Well, not anybody that they didn't stop it for. When they were done, they were dead. The goal was to humiliate and murder these people, and then their bodies were often taken and thrown out to be eaten by dogs. Okay, so they weren't provided any kind of help in any way. But interestingly, Josephus, the Jewish historian, mentions 3 individuals that were taken off the cross because they were accused and put on there, and he intervened and had them removed from the cross. And then they were given the best medical care that Rome could offer. All right? So these 3 individuals, we don't even know how long they were on the cross. All right? They may not even been on there very long at all. Then they were given the best medical attention anybody could afford, and 2 of them still died. So the idea that Jesus was on the cross as long as he was, and then also thrust through with that spear in the side, and then taken off, and then taken away, and given no medical attention, not the best Rome had to offer even, and those guys, 2 of those guys still died. The likelihood that Jesus did not die on the cross it defies the historical and medical evidence. In 1986, Dr. William Edwards, a journal of the American Medical Association, Clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. Okay? By the way, in 1982, Michael Bagent, in their Holy Blood, Holy Grail book, actually do say on page 372, we could not and still cannot prove the accuracy of our conclusion. In other words, it's a hypothesis we're throwing out, but we don't actually have any proof for it. What could possibly have motivated Jesus? We talk about his disciples stealing him, whether or not the Romans would have agreed to the plot. What would motivate Jesus to willingly allow himself to be degraded and brutalized the way that he did? Would somebody who intended to fake their death and prove themselves resurrected walk through that scenario of suffering to die and rise? All right, we're going to move on to the second question. Comments or questions on that? The second step is this. Was Jesus really placed in a tomb? Often crucified individuals were left for the birds or thrown in common graves. John Dominic Crossan, a member of the Jesus Seminar, extreme liberal in regard to the New Testament, Jesus' body was probably dug up and devoured by wild dogs. Is it plausible that Jesus would have been handed over to Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the very council that Jesus was condemned by, the Sanhedrin? That's another fact that adds to the authenticity of the New Testament documents, is that Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin who condemned Jesus, is painted in a positive light when a lot of Jesus' disciples, like Peter, deny him or flee in terror. So his very disciples, you're making all of this up, and your heroes are afraid and flee and deny, and a guy who's part of the member of the council that opposed your leader is painted as a good guy. So that adds to the historical authenticity of the New Testament's accounts. Luke contends that Joseph was not present at the vote, Luke 23:51. He's not the type who would have been invented by Christian authors. They were angry at them. They elevated him over some of the disciples. And here's another fact that adds to the authenticity. If you're making this up, why give a specific name and group that could be checked out? Why name an actual person and an actual group of individuals you could just go check the facts with? So often when you're making things up, you're very vague. You don't give details that can be checked out, but the New Testament doesn't do that. If this was legend, you would expect to find competing burial accounts from that time, and I'm not aware of any. Okay, so I think that one doesn't take very long. We believe it was placed in the tomb. But the third step is, was the tomb really secure? Some contend Jesus' body was stolen from the tomb, right? So first century tombs, you've seen pictures of them, right? The slanted groove that led down to a low entrance. It's slanted so they can roll the stone. Again, slanted so they can roll the stone. To get it off, where you got to roll it? Up, okay? So it's not just rolling it and getting away. You would roll it up and try not to be noisy. And then you required several men to roll it up the slanted groove. Were there guards at the tomb? Matthew 28:4 says that. Again, is that just the New Testament saying there were guards at the tomb? Well, early Jewish Christian debates look like this. Christians say, Jesus is risen. The Jews say, you must have stolen the body. Christians say, the guards prevented that. The Jews say, there were no guards. No, they don't say that. They say, the guards prevented that. Christians say the guards prevented that. Jewish people said, the guards must have fallen asleep. Okay, that's part of the explanation. Not that there weren't guards. Guards must have fallen asleep. If there had been no guards, the argument would have been, what guards? But that's not the argument. Okay, so the guards is a good thing. They were there. Even the Jews opposed to Christ's resurrection conceded to the presence of guards. Okay, and it's hypothesis that they fell asleep. But the idea that they were not awoken by multiple men trying to get it up and realizing the consequence they would have suffered for letting Jesus of Nazareth be taken away is pretty extreme. It's a hard hypothesis. The next question, if it was secure, was it really empty? The question in early writing, again, is not whether it's empty, but what happened to the body. Would Roman guards have allowed that body to be stolen? Women at the tomb helped to authenticate the accounts because a woman's testimony at that time was not considered valid in court. So why would they, if making up this story, give a woman the privilege of the first eyewitness to the empty tomb and the resurrection of Jesus when their testimony would not count? If you're making this up as a Jewish male in Jesus' time, a Jewish male is the eyewitness. Okay? A woman, that adds to the authenticity, but it's just like Jesus, isn't it? To give that privilege to Mary Magdalene. The site of Christ's burial would have been known to both Christians and Jewish leaders alike. What reason did the disciples have to steal the body of Jesus? Michael Grant, historian and professor at Edinburgh, in Jesus, an historical review of the Gospels. You know this is serious because he said, an historical. Okay. True, the discovery of the empty tomb is differently described by the various Gospels, but if we apply the same sort of criterion we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. And what he mentions is that there are different details about the resurrection and burial account, because some include more details and others leave details out. It's not that they're contradictory, but some might say, well, they don't even say the exact same thing. No eyewitness testimony of the same event typically say the exact same thing. They include different things. The question is, are they contradictory? And I would contend that they are not. But he says, applying the historical method we apply to everything else, we would conclude that the tomb was empty. And then Sir Norman Anderson, he's a Cambridge-educated lawyer, offered professorship for life at Harvard, dean of faculty in laws at University of London. He says the empty tomb then forms a veritable rock on which all rationalistic theories of the resurrection dash themselves in vain. So he studied the resurrection from a lawyer standpoint and a historian standpoint, and being able to defend the accuracy of their eyewitness testimony, and he concludes the tomb was empty. Okay? There are no good explanations otherwise. So was Jesus seen alive? And we'll get more evidence for Jesus getting away from the tomb and the plausibility of the disciples in this next question. But was Jesus actually seen alive? Are there eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection from the dead? The answer is actually no. It's a tricky question. But the answer is no, because nobody saw him rise from the dead, right? He was already gone when the first witnesses get to the tomb. So some people would say, well, that hurts the case, right? Nobody actually saw him raised from the dead. But science is all about cause and effect. We don't see dinosaurs. We study fossils. We may not know how a disease originates, but we study its symptoms. We may not witness a crime, but we study the evidence that took place. So the question is, did Jesus die on the cross? We've established yes, historically. Did he appear to people later alive? We've yet to prove. We're about to. If we prove those two things, then did we have to see him raised from the dead? If we prove that Jesus was dead and placed in a tomb, and we prove that people saw him alive after that, we don't have to have had somebody there watch him sit up. It's enough to say, okay, what else could have happened except that he rose from the dead? So the question is, does it really hurt that nobody was there when he rose up? Paul's authorship of 1 Corinthians is pretty widely accepted. Okay? There are a lot of people who debate different documents and who wrote them in the New Testament. Paul writing 1 Corinthians is pretty widely accepted, even by skeptics. Okay? Chapter 9, verse 1 and 15:8 have him claiming to have seen the resurrected Jesus. He says he received this tradition and delivered it to them, rabbinic terms for passing on a tradition or a creed. Jehoiakim Jeremias calls it the earliest tradition of all. Ulrich Wilkins says it indubitably, great word, goes back to the oldest phase of all in the history of the primitive Christianity. It's actually typically dated within 2 to 8 years of the resurrection itself. And what I mean is what Paul says, what I received, I delivered to you. That Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. He appeared to these people and these people, these people, these people, and he lists all the people, and then to 500. That tradition he received, he passed on. Was a tradition that historians looking at the New Testament documents say probably goes back 2 to 8 years of the resurrection itself. And we think may have even been an early hymn, some of what 1 Corinthians and Philippians 2, which means it's early enough to be checked by individuals. Chapter 15, 5 through 8, with the individuals that he points out by name, and the 500, which he says many of which are still alive. Okay? So this is early enough to be checked. So that adds to the authenticity as well, is that Paul is willing to list a bunch of historical people that they can then go ask whether or not he's just making this up. And 500 people of which he's got to be able to produce. It'd be convenient if he said, well, they're all dead now. You can't ask any of them. But he doesn't say that. So that adds to it even more. Many of which are still alive, he makes sure to point out. In other words, if we want to produce some, we can. So the idea that Jesus appeared to people, or at least that the disciples believed that Jesus appeared, is a historical fact that's pretty beyond dispute. Why don't we find non-Christian sources confirming the resurrection of Christ in history? Again, if it really happened, would you have non-believers confirming the resurrection of Jesus? No, that's we talked about this last time in light of the New Testament documents. It's a contradiction. By the time they believe in the resurrection of Jesus, they're not non-believers anymore. You're not going to have non-believers confirming their belief in the resurrection of Jesus. So it's not surprising to me that you don't have that, because you're not going to have that. By the way, though, what stance did Paul, who wrote 1 Corinthians 15, take on Jesus in the beginning? He was a non-believer. So you don't have non-believers confessing their belief in Jesus, because that's a logical contradiction. But you do have a fierce, non-believing opponent of Jesus who now dies for Jesus. And that matters. If anybody wanted to write off their vision of Jesus having appeared to them as some kind of hallucination, it would have been the enemy of the cross in the middle of heading to Damascus. Why not just say this is some kind of mirage? This is a hallucination. This is something I didn't see. Especially since Jesus doesn't come to him on the road to Damascus and talk to Ananias saying, I'll give you riches, I'll give you glory. What does he tell Ananias he needs Paul to know he's going to use him for? I need to show him all the things he will suffer for my name. If anybody has a reason to make up and push against having actually seen Jesus, it's Saul of Tarsus, and he doesn't do it. It's pretty historically verifiable that Saul of Tarsus was a non-believer who persecuted Christianity and then died for it. Okay? There are individuals who will say things like, well, maybe he had a Gentile friend as a kid, he was sympathetic to Gentiles, and therefore he became a Christian so that he could spread the news to Gentiles, because the Jewish message was just for the Jews, but the Christian message maybe... Man, remember our restrained results rule about not stretching things so far that they don't prove anything? It's a hypothesis that is complete conjecture. Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. He appears to other women in Matthew 28, Cleopas and another disciple in Luke 24, 11 other disciples in Luke 24, 10 apostles and others with Thomas absent in John 12, Thomas and other apostles in John 20, the first part of the verse, and then the next one, John 20, 26 through 30, then the 7 apostles in John 21, the disciples in Matthew 28, the apostles and perhaps others at the Mount of Olives in Luke 24 and Acts 1, and then you have Paul saying the appearance to Cephas and to James, and then to Paul, and then to the 500. This is multiple appearances, numerous people. It's not a shadowy sighting by 1 or 2 people. Again, the testimony of the former persecutor of the church, having been an eyewitness to Christ, is significant. You have multiple things that fight up against the idea that, well, just a few people said they saw him and they were already believers and they really wanted him to be resurrected, and all of the facts do not account for everything we've just listed. Can their testimony be trusted? Were they biased? Were they lied? We actually mentioned this in the New Testament document study in the past, but I think it's worth repeating here. Yes, they were biased, but does bias always mean you're going to lie? No, we all have bias. You just have to try to remove it as much as possible. But consider, again, these following, in case you weren't here last time, they include embarrassing failures, which adds to the authenticity. They're just making it up. Why do you include that? Why do you include difficult sayings, things hard to understand sometimes, demanding sayings, if you're just trying to convert people and get them to follow you, events about the resurrection that are difficult to understand as forged, which we talked about, Joseph of Arimathea, Mary Magdalene as the first witness, carefully distinguishing between Jesus' words and their own, not elevating themselves a little more, which we might typically see. Nope. Did I turn it off? Am I off? We go to the next one? I'll just go from my paper. I have them here. They include more than 30 historically confirmed people, which you can check out with the facts. There's always the challenge to check out the facts in the New Testament. Miracles were simple and unembellished. And what did they have to gain? Riches? No. The whole idea of Christianity, and Jesus says, sell all you have and follow me. And the idea of earthly gain and fame. Now, they knew the likelihood of preaching the crucifixion of Jesus right there in Jerusalem where he was crucified would get them in trouble too, and they were willing to die. Okay? The apostles' martyrdom was not a glory. Well, would they die for what they knew was a lie? People say, well, plenty of people die for their beliefs, not for what they know is a lie. Suicide bombers, they don't know that what Muhammad did was a lie. They don't know that. They're not making it up. They're following something they believe happened, but if they were a lie, they could have been hoodwinked. We're talking about guys who know if they made up that they saw Jesus, or if they stole his body and then made up that he resurrected, they know it's a lie. They're willing to die for what they know. And they don't need it. They're already the people of God. They're all Jews. They don't need this. They would also be alienated from their families and other individuals who, by Jewish religion, think this is a rabbi trying to destroy the law of Moses and was humiliated by the Romans. Curses everyone who dies on a tree. They don't need this. Okay? But what if they hallucinated the appearance? Gary Collins, I can't get it up there, but I'll read it to you. He's a doctorate professor, 20 years, author of multiple books on psychological issues, once the president of the National Association of Psychologists. He was asked whether it was possible that these were hallucinations. He wrote, hallucinations are individual occurrences. By their very nature, only one person can see a given hallucination at a time. They certainly aren't something which can be seen by a group of people. Neither is it possible that one person could somehow induce an hallucination in somebody else. Since a hallucination exists only in this subjective personal sense, it is obvious that others cannot witness it. Okay? The disciples were also fearful, doubtful, in despair. Why does that matter? Because people who hallucinate need a fertile mind of expectancy and anticipation. They're usually caused by drugs or bodily deprivation. How do we also account for them touching him? They must also have hallucinated the tomb is empty. According to the earliest traditions about Thomas, he preached the gospel in Parthia and India and enraged pagan priests and was thrust through with a spear. Why would a man so bent on, I'm not going to believe unless I can touch him? Why would he be hoodwinked by hallucination or groupthink? That's a man who's not going to believe it. Then he goes on and is willing to be martyred for it. And then again, they all proclaimed it right there in Jerusalem, where they would themselves be subject to similar things that Jesus went through. Then Saul of Tarsus. All of that, is he really going to not write that off as hallucination? Nabil Qureshi wrote about what crucifixion was like. Cicero called it the extreme and ultimate punishment of slaves. The very mention of the cross should be far removed not only from the Roman citizen's body, but from his mind, his eyes, his ears. The term excruciating comes from a term that means out of the cross. It was a word invented to describe the pain of the cross. Josephus called it the most pitiable of death. Victims were often left on display for other people to see. The goal of the cross wasn't just death, it was humiliation. Most of them hung there naked, as I believe Jesus did. We see him with a towel or whatever around him in paintings. That's just a courtesy. You count the pieces of clothes that they gambled with. Oftentimes they would, I know this is graphic, but it's important to understand. Oftentimes they would hang the dead bodies of their slain sons around their necks while they were crucified. They violated their wives in front of them while they were being crucified. The goal of the Roman soldiers crucifying someone was to humiliate them beyond a degree that anyone would ever try to defy Rome. And then you have Alexamenos, the Greek inscription later, that has a crucified man with a donkey as the head that says Alexamenos worships his God. It's a mockery of Christianity. They don't just say that this crucified man is alive again. They say that this humiliated, crucified man who tried to destroy the law of Moses is the Jewish Messiah, and they worship him as God. That's why Paul says the message of the cross is foolishness, not just to the Jew, but to the Greek. Michael Green, British theologian, will close with this, says the appearances of Jesus are as well authenticated as anything in antiquity. He goes on to say, the main reasons why Christians became sure of the resurrection in the earliest days was just this. They could say with assurance, we've seen the Lord. They knew it was he. Comments, questions? I hope this was faith building for you. I love it. All right, let's say a prayer. God, thank you so much for the time we spent together. Thank you for your Son. Thank you for the resurrection. Father, we are horrified by the things that took place on the cross, but we are so grateful for your willingness to send your Son for us. We pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.